Stop scrolling because you are about to witness the ultimate revenge of a dreamer who was pushed into the dirt and left for dead. They laughed at her broken shoes and mocked her grand visions while she worked in the shadows of a tiny basement. They called her a fool and told her that girls from the streets don't build empires. But the tables are about to turn in a way no one saw coming. Years later, those same bullies are lining up at her door begging for a second chance. Stay tuned because the ending of this story will prove that the best way to silence your enemies is not with words, but with the level of success they have to beg to be a part of. The cold wind rattled the thin window panes of a cramped apartment on the edge of the industrial district, where Elias sat huddled over a glowing monitor that was the only source of light in his world. To anyone walking past the decaying brick building, he was just another face in a neighborhood that the city had forgotten, but inside his mind he was architecting a digital revolution that would one day bridge the gap between the elite and the ignored. He grew up in an environment where the smell of grease and burnt rubber was more common than the scent of fresh air, and where the sound of sirens acted as a nightly lullaby for children who learned early on that dreaming was a luxury they could not afford. His father worked double shifts at the local steel mill, coming home with hands so callous they looked like stone, while his mother cleaned the offices of men who didn't even know her name. They loved him, but they were practical people who viewed his obsession with computers as a dangerous distraction from the reality of their survival. They wanted him to learn a trade or find a steady union job that offered a pension and a predictable path, but Elias felt a different kind of hunger that couldn't be satisfied by a steady paycheck. He spent his afternoons at the public library until they kicked him out at closing. Welcome back to Revenge Water Official. If you are enjoying the content and want to support the journey, then make sure you hit that subscribe button right now and turn on all notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support helps Revenge Water Official grow and bring you even better videos every single day, so join the family today by clicking subscribe, and thank you for being part of the team. Time and then he would head to the back of an old electronics repair shop, where the owner let him sift through the bins of discarded motherboards and frayed cables. He was a scavenger of possibilities, building his first machine from the literal trash of a society that discarded anything it deemed obsolete. Every morning he walked to his shift at the local garage where the head mechanic, a man named Miller, took every opportunity to remind him that he was wasting his life. Miller was a mountain of a man with skin stained permanently gray by engine oil, and he believed that value was only found in things you could touch with your hands. He would see Elias sketching network diagrams in the margins of old invoices, and let out a booming laugh that gathered the attention of the other mechanics. "Look at the professor over here trying to build a brain out of thin air," Miller would shout, while the others wiped their greasy hands on their overalls and joined in the mockery. They called him the glitch and told him that while he was busy dreaming of a digital world, the real world was passing him by and leaving him in the dust. The regulars at the garage were no kinder as they brought in their rusted trucks and beat-up sedans, looking for someone to blame for their own frustrations, and finding an easy target in the quiet boy with the faraway look in his eyes. They would ask him if his computer could fix a blown gasket or if his internet friends were going to pay his rent when he inevitably failed. Elias would keep his head down and his jaw tight, focusing on the rhythm of the wrenches and the steady drip of oil, because he knew that any breath spent defending himself was a breath stolen from his vision. The most painful part of the ridicule came from the people he had grown up with, who had once been his brothers in the struggle of the streets. Marcus was the unofficial leader of their group, a charismatic and athletic young man who had accepted his lot in life and expected everyone else to do the same. Marcus and the rest of the crew would hang out on the corner near the apartment building, watching the world go by with a cynical detachment that Elias found terrifying. Whenever Elias walked past them carrying a box of old parts or a stack of technical manuals, Marcus would block his path with a grin that didn't reach his eyes. He would ask Elias why he was trying so hard to leave them behind and if he thought he was better than the neighborhood that raised him. They mocked his worn-out sneakers and the way his clothes always seemed a size too large, as if he were trying to grow into a version of himself that didn't exist yet. They didn't understand that for Elias the computer wasn't just a machine but a portal to a world where his zip code didn't define his potential. He tried once to explain the concept of the Nexus platform he was building, telling them it could provide free education and job opportunities to people in neighborhoods just like theirs, but they just laughed and told him he sounded like a commercial for a college he would never attend. The pressure at home was a different kind of weight because it was wrapped in a love that felt like a cage. His father would sit at the kitchen table with a heavy sigh, looking at the sketches Elias left out, and tell him that hope was a debt he could never pay back. His father believed that the only way for a man to maintain his dignity was to work until his body broke, and he saw Elias's intellectual pursuits as a form of laziness. "Why are you staring at a screen when there is work to be done in the real world?" his father would ask with a voice full of a weariness that broke Elias's heart. His mother would try to soften the blow, but her eyes were always filled with a pity that hurt more than the anger, because she truly believed he was setting himself up for a massive heartbreak. She would suggest he apply for a janitorial position at the hospital where she worked, saying it was a good job with benefits and a chance for a stable life. They couldn't see the lines of code that were dancing behind his eyelids, or the way he was connecting the dots between global markets and local needs. He felt like he was speaking a foreign language in his own home, and the loneliness of being misunderstood by those who loved him most was a cold shadow that followed him everywhere. Despite the constant barrage of negativity, Elias poured every spare second into the development of Nexus. He taught himself advanced mathematics and complex programming languages by reading books he found in the trash or borrowed from university students who didn't want them anymore. He would sit in his freezing room with a blanket wrapped around his shoulders, his breath visible in the air as he typed until his fingers went numb. He had no mentor and no guide, only the stubborn belief that he was right and the rest of the world was wrong. He survived on the cheapest food possible, often skipping meals to save money for server hosting fees that were slowly draining his meager savings. There were nights when the doubt would creep in like a poisonous gas, making him wonder if Marcus and Miller were right, and if he was just a fool chasing a ghost. He would look at his reflection in the cracked mirror and see a tired young man with dark circles under his eyes, and he would ask himself if the struggle was worth the sacrifice. But then a line of code would work or a new feature would click into place, and the rush of adrenaline would be enough to carry him through another week of mockery. The turning point of his early years came during a particularly brutal winter when the garage was slow and Miller decided to cut Elias's hours. Without the full paycheck, he couldn't afford both his rent and the electricity needed to keep his servers running. He had to make a choice between his physical comfort and his digital dream, and he chose the dream without a second thought. He moved out of the apartment and into the small storage unit where he kept his spare parts, and he began living a double life. By day he was the lowly garage hand who took the insults with a silent nod, and by night, he was the king of a growing digital underground. He used the public showers at the local park and ate discarded bread from the bakery down the street, but his mind was more alive than it had ever been. He began to see patterns in the way people use the internet, and he realized that the current systems were built to exploit the poor rather than empower them. He redesigned Nexus to be a decentralized network that couldn't be controlled by a single corporation or government, and he felt a sense of power that he had never known before. He was building a weapon of mass education, and he was doing it right under the noses of the people who thought he was nothing. One night Marcus and his crew found the storage unit and realized that Elias was living there. They didn't offer help or empathy, but instead they saw it as the ultimate proof of his failure. They stood outside the corrugated metal door laughing and shouting about how the great visionary was now living like a rat in a box. They kicked the door until it rattled and told him to come out and face the reality that he was a loser who had lost everything for a fantasy. Elias sat inside in the dark listening to their taunts and felt a strange sense of calm wash over him. He realized that their mockery was no longer a burden, but a confirmation that he was on a path they could never follow. He didn't come out and he didn't argue, because he knew that the gap between his future and their present was now too wide to bridge with words. He waited until they left, and then he went back to his keyboard, his fingers moving with a new sense of purpose. He was no longer trying to prove them wrong for their sake, but for the sake of every other kid who was currently sitting in a dark room somewhere believing that their dreams were a mistake. This was the end of the beginning, and as the first light of dawn hit the metal door, Elias knew that the world was about to change, and he was the one holding the key. The transition from the cold storage unit to the unforgiving streets of the city center was a journey of 1,000 miles condensed into a single bus ride that Elias took with nothing but a cracked laptop and the burning fire of a man with nothing left to lose. He arrived in the heart of the tech district feeling like an alien in a land of glass and steel where everyone moved with a sense of purpose and wore clothes that cost more than his father made in a year. He spent his first few weeks sleeping on the hard plastic chairs of 24-hour laundromats and using the bathrooms in luxury hotels to wash his face before heading to the public library to continue his work. The mockery followed him even here, but it changed its form from the loud insults of the garage to the quiet judgmental stares of the elite. When he sat in the corner of the library, his clothes smelling slightly of damp concrete, and his hair overgrown, people would pull their bags closer and whisper about the homeless boy playing on a computer. They didn't see the complex algorithms dancing across his screen, or the way he was rerouting data packets to create a more efficient server architecture. They only saw his surface, and in their eyes he was a nuisance, a glitch in their perfect city, but Elias used their invisibility as his greatest strength. He watched them and learned their habits, realizing that the people at the top were often blinded by their own comfort, while he was being sharpened by the very friction of his survival. By the second month of his urban exile, Elias had managed to secure a job delivering food on a bicycle, which allowed him to map the city and save every penny for server maintenance. He would pedal through freezing rain and sweltering heat, carrying bags of expensive sushi to people who wouldn't even look him in the eye when they took the food. One afternoon, he delivered a large order to a high-end incubator office where young entrepreneurs were pitching ideas for apps that solved problems for the wealthy, like dog walking services or luxury car rentals. He stood in the lobby holding the heavy thermal bag, listening to a group of investors laugh about a failed startup, and he felt a surge of righteous anger. They were playing with millions while he was fighting for cents to build something that could actually change the lives of people like his parents. He took a risk that day and tucked a small handwritten note with the URL of his platform into the pocket of a prominent venture capitalist's jacket as he walked by. He didn't expect a call, but he needed to feel like he was fighting back against the silence. As he cycled away in the rain, he could almost hear Miller's voice echoing from back home, telling him that he was a delivery boy and nothing more, but Elias just pedaled harder until his legs burned and his lungs felt like they were filled with broken glass. The digital landscape of Nexus began to grow in the shadows of the internet as word spread through underground forums about a new platform that was fast, secure, and completely free of corporate tracking. Users from all over the world began to flock to his creation, and for the first time Elias saw the numbers on his dashboard start to move in a way that felt like a heartbeat. He was managing a community of thousands from a park bench or a crowded food court, always one step ahead of the security guards who wanted to move him along. He met an elderly man named Arthur who spent his days reading philosophy in the park and realized that Elias was more than just a drifter. Arthur was a retired systems engineer who had been pushed out of the industry during the last dot-com crash, and he saw the genius in Elias's eyes that everyone else had missed. They began to meet every day, and Arthur became the mentor Elias never had, teaching him how to structure a business and how to protect his intellectual property from the vultures who would eventually come to scavenge it. Arthur told him that the world would try to steal his fire and then ask him why he was cold, and that he must build a fortress around his vision. Back in the old neighborhood, the stories about Elias had turned into a local legend of failure. Marcus and the crew would sit in the park sharing a bottle of cheap liquor and telling the younger kids about the boy who thought he was a king but ended up as a beggar in the city. They shared old photos of him working in the garage and turned them into memes to laugh at his expense. Marcus would tell people that Elias was probably washing dishes or living in a shelter because that was the natural order of things for people like them. The mockery was a way for them to justify their own lack of ambition, because if Elias succeeded, it would mean that they were the ones who had chosen to stay small. They needed him to fail so they could feel right about giving up. Even his father had stopped mentioning his name at the dinner table, the silence in the house becoming a monument to the disappointment he felt. His mother, however, kept a small box of his old drawings under her bed, praying that her son was at least safe and fed, even if his dreams had led him into the wilderness. She didn't know that the boy she worried about was currently architecting a system that was starting to draw the attention of the very giants he intended to topple. The first real test of his resolve came when a mid-sized tech company discovered Nexus and tried to buy it for a pittance. The CEO, a man who smelled of expensive tobacco and condescension, invited Elias to a meeting in a glass-walled office that felt like a cage. He offered Elias $50,000, which seemed like a fortune to someone living on protein bars and tap water, but Elias saw the trap. The company wanted to take his code, strip away the free access, and turn it into a subscription service for the elite. The CEO laughed when Elias hesitated, telling him that a boy in a thrift store suit should take the money and run before the real world crushed him. He told Elias that he was a lucky amateur who didn't understand how the game was played. Elias looked at the man and saw the same expression he had seen on Miller and Marcus, the look of someone who thought they knew his worth better than he did. He turned down the offer and walked out of the building without looking back, feeling the weight of the CEO's laughter hit him in the spine. He went back to the library that night and coded for 18 hours straight, fueled by a cold fury that made his hands move like lightning across the keys. He realized that the only way to protect his dream was to become so big that they couldn't ignore him and so strong that they couldn't break him. Hunger became a constant companion during that third year as the server costs began to outpace his delivery earnings. There were days when he would faint from exhaustion only to wake up and get back on his bike because the mission was more important than his physical survival. He became a ghost in the city, a shadow that moved between the cracks of the system. He learned how to fix his own hardware with scavenged parts and how to optimize his code so that it ran on a fraction of the power his competitors used. The mockery from his past continued to reach him through the internet as he occasionally checked his old social media accounts. He saw Marcus bragging about a new car he had bought with a high-interest loan, and he saw the comments from old neighbors asking if anyone had seen the crazy computer kid. They were living in a world of immediate gratification, while he was building a legacy in the dark. He didn't feel anger anymore, only a profound sense of distance. He was no longer the boy they mocked. He was something else entirely, something they couldn't even name. The breakthrough finally came on a Tuesday night in the middle of a thunderstorm when a global news organization published an article about the rise of decentralized platforms mentioning Nexus as the gold standard of the new movement. Suddenly the traffic on his site exploded from thousands to millions in a matter of hours. The servers he had built from scrap metal began to smoke under the pressure, and Elias found himself working frantically to keep the system from collapsing. He was in a 24-hour cafe with a single cup of coffee that he had been nursing for 5 hours, his eyes bloodshot and his heart racing. This was the moment he had sacrificed everything for, the moment when the world finally looked at what he had built. By morning he had 300 emails from investors, journalists and collaborators. The boy who was laughed at by the mechanics and mocked by the neighborhood crew was now the most sought-after person in the tech world. He sat back in his plastic chair as the sun began to rise over the city, and for the first time in years he allowed himself to breathe. He knew that the struggle was far from over, but the balance of power had shifted. The world was no longer something he had to survive. It was something he was going to lead. The shift from being a ghost in the machine to a titan in the boardroom happened so fast that Elena felt like she was suffering from a permanent case of decompression sickness. After the global news breakout, the name Elena Vance was no longer a joke whispered in the dive bars of her Ohio hometown, but a headline that moved markets in New York and Silicon Valley. She moved into a minimalist office in San Francisco that overlooked the bay where the fog rolled in like the heavy smoke of the factories she had left behind. But even as she sat in designer chairs and signed contracts worth more than the entire net worth of her home county, the voices of the past didn't just disappear. They morphed. Back in Ohio, the narrative had shifted from making fun of her failure to resenting her success. She would occasionally scroll through the town's community Facebook page and see the toxic mixture of jealousy and false pride. People who had once thrown rocks at her garage window were now posting photos of her childhood home, claiming they always knew she was destined for greatness. Marcus, the former high school star who had led the chorus of her tormentors, was now a local foreman who spent his nights at the bar telling anyone who would listen that Elena owed him for the tough love he provided. He told people that he was the one who kept her grounded, and that her success was built on the grit she learned by standing up to him. Elena read these things with a hollow feeling in her chest, realizing that the people who mocked her dreams were now trying to claim ownership of her reality. In the corporate world of the West Coast, the mockery was more refined but just as sharp. She was a young woman from a blue-collar background with no Ivy League degree and no family connections in a world built on pedigree. At her first major industry gala, she stood in a room filled with silver-haired billionaires who looked at her as if she were a lucky lottery winner rather than a brilliant engineer. They spoke over her at dinner tables and asked her who really wrote the code for Nexus, assuming that a girl